The wind howled across the dusty plains of Red Ridge as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Inside a small wooden house at the edge of town, the cries of a newborn baby echoed softly, fragile and trembling like a bird learning to sing for the first time. Sarah Whitmore lay exhausted on the narrow bed, her arms wrapped protectively around the tiny bundle in her arms. Tears slid silently down her cheeks as she looked at her daughter's delicate face. The baby's tiny fingers curled around Sarah's thumb. And in that moment Sarah felt a love, deeper than the ocean and stronger than the storms that rolled across the western frontier. But that love would soon be tested in ways she never imagined. The front door burst open with a violent slam that shook the fragile house. Heavy boots stomped across the wooden floor. Sarah's husband, Thomas Whitmore, staggered inside, his face twisted with anger and disappointment. The smell of whiskey filled the room like poison in the air. "So, it's done," he growled coldly. Sarah's voice trembled but remained gentle. "Thomas, she's beautiful. Look at her." She lifted the baby slightly, her eyes pleading for a moment of kindness. But Thomas's face hardened like stone. "A girl." He spat the word like it burned his tongue. The room fell silent except for the baby's quiet whimper. Sarah's heart began to pound. She had feared this moment. In this cruel corner of the world, many men believed daughters were nothing but burdens. Thomas slammed his fist against the wall. "I wanted a son," he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "A son to carry my name, to work my land. Not another mouth to feed." The baby began to cry louder as if sensing the storm in the room. Sarah tightened her arms protectively around her daughter. "Thomas, please. She's your child." But mercy had already left his heart. In a sudden burst of rage he grabbed the wooden chair and kicked it across the room. "You useless woman," he shouted. "You couldn't even give me a boy." The first blow came without warning. Sarah gasped as pain shot through her body. She curled around the baby, shielding the tiny life with her own fragile frame. Each strike felt like thunder crashing against her bones. Yet she refused to let go of her daughter. Outside, the wind carried the echoes of violence across the empty plains. But fate was already guiding someone toward that house. Miles away, a lone rider galloped across the golden prairie beneath the fading sunset. The rider was Ethan Carter, a man known throughout the Western Territories as the richest cattle baron in 3 states. His vast ranch stretched beyond the horizon, and his name carried both respect and fear. Yet despite his wealth and power, Ethan Carter was a quiet man who preferred the company of horses and open skies to crowded towns. That evening he had been riding back from a business meeting when he heard something unusual carried by the wind. A cry. Not just any cry. A woman's desperate scream. Ethan's horse slowed as his sharp eyes scanned the distant houses of Red Ridge. Another cry echoed faintly. Ethan's jaw tightened. He turned his horse toward the sound without hesitation. Back inside the house, Sarah's strength was fading. Thomas raised his hand again, fury burning in his eyes. "Maybe next time you'll remember what I expect from my wife," he roared. But the next sound was not another strike. It was the thunder of hooves outside. Thomas froze. The door burst open again, this time with a force that rattled the hinges. A tall man stepped inside, his long coat flowing behind him, dust swirling around his boots. Ethan Carter's piercing blue eyes swept across the room, instantly understanding everything. The terrified woman on the bed, the crying baby, the drunken men with raised fists. The silence that followed felt heavier than the mountains. Thomas sneered. "Who the hell are you?" Ethan's voice was calm but carried the weight of iron. "The man who's about to stop you." Thomas laughed harshly. "This is my house. My wife." Ethan took a slow step forward, his eyes burning with quiet fury. "Not tonight." The air turned electric. Thomas lunged forward in anger, but Ethan moved faster. One swift punch sent Thomas crashing to the floor. The room fell silent except for the baby's crying. Ethan turned toward Sarah, his expression softening for the first time. "You're safe now," he said quietly. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. No one had ever stood up for her before. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched her daughter closer. Ethan removed his coat and gently wrapped it around both mother and child. "What's her name?" he asked. Sarah looked down at the baby's tiny face. "Lily." Ethan nodded slowly, as if committing the name to memory. "Beautiful name." Outside, the night had fully fallen, and the stars shimmered above the endless western plains. Ethan helped Sarah to her feet carefully. She was weak but determined. "Where will we go?" she whispered. Ethan looked toward the distant hills where his ranch lights flickered like distant stars. "Home," he said firmly. "You and Lily will come with me." At that moment Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. As Ethan carried the fragile baby toward his waiting horse and helped Sarah climb beside him, the cold wind of the frontier seemed a little warmer. Behind them the broken house of Red Ridge faded into darkness. But ahead of them lay a future none of them could yet imagine. A future where a little girl born into cruelty might grow up surrounded by love. Yet destiny was far from finished writing their story. Because the richest cowboy in the West had just made a choice that would change all three of their lives forever. And sometimes, the smallest lives create the biggest miracles. Before we continue the incredible journey of Sarah, Lily, and the mysterious millionaire cowboy Ethan Carter, take a moment to support stories like this. The night wind swept across the vast plains as Ethan Carter's horse galloped steadily through the darkness, carrying Sarah and her newborn daughter, Lily, toward a future neither of them could yet understand. The stars above the western sky glittered like 1,000 silent witnesses, watching as the powerful millionaire cowboy rode with a quiet determination that few people in the territory had ever seen before. Sarah sat carefully behind him, one arm wrapped protectively around baby Lily, the other holding onto Ethan's coat as the horse thundered across the open land. Her body still ached from the brutal beating she had endured only hours earlier. But somehow the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the calm strength of the men guiding it gave her a fragile sense of safety she had not felt in years. For the first time since Lily had been born, Sarah allowed herself to breathe slowly, whispering soft comforting words to the tiny child in her arms. Lily had stopped crying and now slept quietly, her tiny face peaceful beneath the warm folds of Ethan's coat. The sight made Sarah's heart ache with a mixture of love and fear. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know if the man in front of her truly meant what he said. But she knew one thing for certain. He had been the only person who had stepped into that dark room and stopped the cruelty that could have destroyed them both. After nearly an hour of riding, lights appeared in the distance, like a small golden constellation, resting on the earth. Sarah blinked in surprise as the outline of a massive ranch slowly came into view. Wide wooden fences stretched across the fields. Strong barns stood proudly under the moonlight, and dozens of horses rested quietly in the paddocks. This was Ethan Carter's ranch, the largest and most prosperous cattle empire in the entire region. Cowboys who worked for him often said the land seemed endless, rolling across hills and valleys like an ocean of grass. When they reached the main house, Ethan gently slowed the horse and helped Sarah down with careful hands. Despite his powerful appearance, his movements were gentle, almost protective. Lanterns flickered along the porch, and within seconds the door opened. An older woman stepped out, her gray hair tied neatly beneath a bonnet. Her name was Margaret, the ranch housekeeper who had practically raised Ethan after he lost his parents many years ago. Her sharp eyes immediately noticed the exhausted young mother and the baby wrapped in Ethan's coat. Ethan Carter, she said with a mix of surprise and curiosity. What have you brought home tonight? Ethan's voice was calm but firm. They're staying here. Margaret studied Sarah's bruised face and trembling hands. Her expression softened instantly. Without asking another question she stepped aside and opened the door wider. Well then, she said kindly. Bring them inside before the night air freezes that little angel. Sarah nearly collapsed from exhaustion as Margaret guided her to a warm chair beside the fireplace. The heat of the flames wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. Margaret quickly brought warm water, blankets, and fresh milk for the baby. For the first time since Lily's birth, Sarah felt tears fall again, but these were different tears. They were tears of relief. Ethan stood quietly near the window watching the dark plains outside, his thoughts heavy. The image of Thomas Whitmore raising his hand against Sarah replayed in his mind again and again. Ethan had seen cruelty before in the harsh frontier, but something about that moment had stirred a deep anger inside him. No child deserved to be born into hatred simply because she was a girl. Days slowly passed on the Carter ranch, and with each sunrise Sarah began to regain her strength. Margaret helped care for Lily while Sarah recovered, often humming soft lullabies that filled the large house with warmth. The cowboys who worked on the ranch soon noticed the small baby as well. At first they were curious about the mysterious woman Ethan had brought home, but their curiosity quickly turned to admiration as they saw the kindness with which Sarah cared for her daughter. Even the toughest ranch hands would stop by the porch just to wave at little Lily, who seemed to bring a strange light into the rugged world of cattle drives and dusty boots. Ethan himself remained a quiet presence. He rarely spoke about that night, but his actions revealed more than words ever could. He ordered a new room prepared for Sarah and Lily, made sure they had proper clothes, and quietly arranged for a doctor from the nearby town to visit and examine Sarah's injuries. Whenever he returned from riding across the ranch, his eyes would often drift toward the porch where Sarah sat rocking Lily gently in her arms. One evening as the golden sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors, Ethan approached the porch slowly. Sarah looked up, slightly nervous. still unsure how to speak to the powerful man who had changed her life so suddenly. Ethan rested his arms on the wooden railing and looked out across the endless fields. "How is she today?" he asked softly. Sarah smiled down at the baby. "Strong. She hardly cries anymore." Ethan nodded, watching the small child curiously. "She's tougher than most grown men." "I know." Sarah hesitated before speaking again. "Why did you help us?" Ethan remained silent for a moment as the wind brushed across the tall grass. Finally he said quietly, "Because someone should have." Sarah looked at him carefully. She realized that behind Ethan Carter's reputation as a powerful millionaire cowboy was a man who carried his own silent scars. Weeks turned into months, and slowly the ranch began to feel like home. Lily grew stronger each day, her bright eyes full of curiosity about the world around her. The ranch workers joked that she was the luckiest baby in the West because she had an entire army of cowboys watching over her. Peace rarely lasts forever on the frontier. One cold morning a rider arrived at the ranch carrying troubling news. Thomas Whitmore had been seen in town asking questions. He had discovered that Sarah and the baby were living on Ethan Carter's land, and he wanted them back. When Sarah heard the news, fear gripped her heart once again. She knew the kind of rage Thomas carried. But Ethan's reaction was very different. He simply stood up from the table, placed his hat on his head, and said calmly, "He won't touch them again." A few days later, Thomas Whitmore himself rode toward the Carter ranch, anger burning in his eyes. But when he reached the gate he found not a frightened woman but a line of determined cowboys standing beside Ethan Carter. The wind blew dust across the ground as Thomas glared at the men who had taken everything from him. "That's my wife and my child," he shouted. Ethan stepped forward slowly. His voice remained calm, but there was steel behind every word. "No," he said firmly. "They're safe here." Thomas realized something in that moment. The woman he once controlled was no longer alone. And the man standing before him was someone even the toughest outlaws in the West avoided crossing. Thomas turned his horse and rode away in bitter silence, disappearing into the horizon forever. Months later the Carter ranch was filled with laughter on a warm summer afternoon. Sarah stood in the tall grass watching Lily take her first tiny steps across the porch while Ethan crouched nearby encouraging her with a rare smile. The once frightened mother who had arrived on that cold night had become part of the ranch family. And the little girl who had been rejected for simply being born a daughter had become the brightest light in Ethan Carter's world. Sometimes destiny doesn't arrive with thunder or glory. Sometimes it rides quietly across the plains, carrying hope where it is needed most. And a silent millionaire cowboy discovered something stronger than cruelty, love, courage, and a second chance at life. If you enjoyed this emotional Western story and want to hear more powerful stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next unforgettable story. Your support helps bring more inspiring stories of courage, justice, and hope to life.